everyone, how's it going? So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to make two desserts using common ingredients. The common ingredients among the two desserts are cranberries. One recipe uses fresh cranberries, the other uses dried cranberries. Another common ingredient, and the main ingredient that is common, is almond flour. And then the third is oranges. In both, I use orange zest, and in one, I use not only orange zest, but also the juice from oranges. So a friend said to me that, oh, this recipe sounds keto or low carb. I suppose it is low carb. I am not too knowledgeable on following a keto or low carb diet, but almond flour certainly is a low carb flour. And this recipe does not have any white refined flours. The only additional, I would say, carb is the addition of tapioca starch in both of the recipes. However, it does have sugar in both of the recipes. One recipe uses cane sugar, and both recipes use maple syrup, which is a sugar. But for the cane sugar, you can substitute coconut sugar to make it a lower glycemic index recipe. So the two recipes I'm going to show you are, well, the first is an almond flour biscotti using dried cranberries and pistachios. And the second is an orange flavored almond flour cake with fresh cranberries inside. So I'm going to move on to showing you how to make both of these recipes. They're fairly quick and fairly easy. And then what I'll do is I'll follow up at the end and I'll do a taste test of both of those. But I'm going to brew some coffee because both of these are good with coffee. Let's start with the orange almond flour biscotti with dried cranberries and pistachios. Place 2 cups of finely ground gluten-free almond flour in a large bowl, then add 1/4 cup of tapioca flour, or you could use cornstarch. Add 1/2 cup of cane sugar, or if you like, you can use coconut sugar. Add 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and finally the zest from 1 orange. Whisk all of these dry ingredients together, and I actually had to pound my whisk up and down a bit to break up any large lumps in in the almond flour. So then you want a separate medium-sized bowl for your wet ingredients. And to that, you want to measure 3 tablespoons of melted refined coconut oil. If you use the unrefined, you will have a slight coconut flavor in your biscotti. To that, add 3 tablespoons of maple syrup. Then add 2 tablespoons of plant milk of your choice. I think I used a combination of cashew and coconut. Then I added 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract and 1/2 teaspoon of almond extract. Then to my dry mixture, I added 1/2 cup of dried cranberries, and I also added 1/2 cup of pistachios that I chopped into finer pieces. Then I whisked all of the dry ingredients together to incorporate the cranberries and the pistachios throughout all of the dry mixture. I then whisked together all of the wet ingredients, and I poured these ingredients into the dry mixture and then started mixing all of the dry and the wet ingredients together. At first, I used this spoon to mix the wet and dry ingredients together, but then I started working the dough with my hands, and I really had to squeeze the dough together to make sure that the liquid was within all of the dry ingredients and everything was coming together and sticking as a cohesive dough. In fact, what I decided to do was then take my dough and rub it into the bowl containing the remainder or the residue of the wet mixture. That added a bit of moisture without adding too much to the dough. So you want to just continue flipping and pressing and kneading the dough until it comes together as one solid ball, because you're going to form this into a log. I lined a baking tray with parchment paper and then I placed the dough ball onto that and I formed it into a log shape. I did this by continuously pressing down and like pushing out the edges to form a log. You're aiming to have a log that's about 9 inches long, 3 inches wide, and about 1 inch tall. After I achieved this size and shape for the biscotti, I then placed it in a preheated 350-degree oven and I baked it for 25 minutes. At this point, it came out looking nice and golden brown on the exterior. I placed it on the counter and I allowed it to cool down for about 15 minutes before I cut it into the biscotti sections. So you want to cut the sections on a diagonal. I cut off the end of the one side of the loaf. And then what you want to do is using a very sharp knife, you want to cut down at a diagonal and you want to make about, I'd say, 8 slices. They should be about 3/4 inch thick. I believe I cut mine a little thick. Some of mine are about an inch thick, but go for about 3/4 inch. So at this stage, the almond biscotti is slightly like a marzipan inside. And what we're going to do is bake it on each side for 10 minutes per side. And that's going to crisp up the exterior of the biscotti. So like I said, as I had them back onto the tray on top of the parchment paper, I put them back into the oven with the one side up and I cooked them for 10 minutes. And then I took them out and flipped each biscotti over and then cooked them for about an additional 10 minutes on the other side. I then put them on a cooling rack and I allowed them to completely cool. It probably took at least an hour, and as they cool, they will harden. So I'll show you how these look inside in a bit, and I'll give you a taste test, but let's move on to the next recipe. Next, I'll show you how to make an orange almond flour cake with fresh cranberries. To a large mixing bowl, add 2 1/2 cups of almond flour. Then add 3 tablespoons of tapioca flour or cornstarch, 1 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Whisk all of these dry ingredients together, again making sure to get rid of any lumps in the almond flour. In a separate medium-sized bowl, add 1/2 cup of maple syrup, 1/3 cup of melted coconut oil. Again, I used refined to avoid the coconut flavor. I then added 1/3 cup of fresh squeezed orange juice and 1/4 cup of non-dairy milk and the zest from 2 oranges. Then 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. I then whisked all of these wet ingredients together. I then used some coconut oil and rubbed it on the inside of a 9-inch spring-form cake pan. I made sure to get the bottom and the sides. I then pressed a piece of parchment paper onto the bottom. I had previously cut this out to fit within the pan. And then I also greased the top of that parchment paper. I washed and drained 1 1/2 cups of fresh cranberries and I put them in a separate bowl. And then I sprinkled them with some cane sugar. I did this so that they would not sink to the bottom of the batter when I put them into the cake pan. I then added all of the wet ingredients to the dry ingredients and I whisked those together. And you'll see it becomes quite a thick and sticky batter. I then added the cranberries to the batter and I folded them in gently to make sure that they were mixed throughout the batter. I then poured the batter into the cake pan and I smoothed the top with the spatula. And then place the cake in a preheated 350-degree Fahrenheit oven, and I baked it for 35 minutes, and I checked it at that time, and it still seemed a bit soft in the middle. I put toothpicks in, and it came out a bit wet, so I put it in for another 10 minutes. I think I baked the cake for a total of 45 minutes. I let the cake cool for about an hour before I tried to loosen the edges around the ring of the pan. So I just ran an icing knife around the edges to loosen it, and then I opened the ring. But then I did cover the cake with some plastic wrap, and I allowed it to cool overnight. The next morning, I had a decorative serving tray that I wanted to use, and then I placed some parchment paper on the edges of that tray so that I could put the cake on it and put the powdered sugar on it. Then I put some sugared fresh cranberries on top and some sugared orange peels just to add a little decorative touch. So I cut the cake. I'm going to give you a view of what it looks like inside. So I'll show you the sides. It's really super moist. And when I say moist, I almost mean like a pudding almost, like a bread pudding. But it's super delicious. It's not very sweet. It's more, well, it definitely has a sweet undertone, but it's more of a tart cranberry and orange flavor. And then you have the richness of the almond flour. I'm going to give a taste test of the cake first. So as you see, I made a slice here. Let me clarify something. When I cut the cake or showed you the sliced cake and said it's like a pudding, what I'm referring to is a pudding in the traditional British sense. Now, I know some of you are going to school me on what a pudding means in the United Kingdom, and absolutely, I would love that. Because here in the United States, a pudding is like a creamy, very gelatinous, soft textured dessert that we eat or scoop out of a bowl. Where in the United Kingdom, I know you can have many forms of pudding. So what I meant to say is that this cake, it is a cake. However, it's very soft in the center. And you're not looking, for those in the United States, don't look for a fluffy textured cake, because that's not this. This is almond flour and some moisture and some tapioca starch. So, and secondly, it doesn't have the gluten in it, so it didn't rise as high and fluffy as a cake would. But that was my goal here. So I'll show you how it slices. As you see, it's quite wet and moist inside. Again, almost like a bread pudding. It's very delicious. It is super rich from the almond flour. And it has such a wonderful note as far as you taste orange, you taste the cranberries. It's very holiday-like and festive. Again, it is a bit, from a textural standpoint, it is a bit like let's say a bread pudding. I absolutely love this. For those of you looking for just a pure, fluffy, bread-like cake, that's not this. But it's certainly delicious, and it makes such a beautiful dessert. It's perfect to take to gatherings. It's perfect to eat on your own, as I will be doing. Anyway, I encourage you, if you give it a try, let me know what you think. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee, and then I'll get you the biscotti. So here's the biscotti. As you can see, it's twice baked. It's quite firm on the exterior. But when you taste it, it may taste, or not taste, but feel slightly different from a traditional biscotti. Traditional biscotti has a crunch to it. This does have a very firm exterior, but due to the almond flour inside, it's got this nice chewy texture. I'm not going to say it's moist like the cake, because it's not. It's definitely dry, but the almond flour lends itself to this delicious chewy texture with the crisp exterior. I'll break it and show you. When There's the almond flour inside. I want to get a bite with some cranberries and the pistachios. Wow, it is, in my opinion, delicious. It is so rich, almost buttery tasting from the almond flour and the combination of the coconut oil. The slight subtle tartness of the dried cranberries complements that sweetness and that richness. And then you taste also the richness of the pistachio nuts. This one is probably slightly sweeter than the cake. However, I'm going to emphasize that both are not a very sweet dessert. I personally am not a fan of overly heavy sweetness. In fact, I bought a bag, and I wanted to suggest to you, I bought a bag of vegan white chocolate chips, and I was going to melt those and drizzle those over these cookies, but I decided I didn't want the deliciousness of this biscotti to be overcome by the overly sweetness of the chips. So if you want to give these as presents to someone during the holidays, you certainly could drizzle over some white chocolate, or even dip them and then put them on a tray and let them dry, or dark chocolate, or vegan milk chocolate if you like. I just like the simplicity of this. I like how delicious it is as is, so that's why I chose not to do that. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you try either of these recipes or maybe both of them. Also, as I always say on this channel, if you have a particular gluten-free, if you have a particular recipe that you would like converted to a gluten-free and vegan recipe, let me know in the comments, and I can hopefully entertain making a video about that in the new year. I have quite a few videos lined up through the end of the year, but I have one outstanding request from someone that I do plan to release in the new year, and that is for a nightshade-free tomato sauce. And I'll see what I can do in addition to just making the tomato sauce. I'll see what I can do with that for giving you some suggestions for recipes for that. But if you have some other conundrums with your allergies or your dietary restrictions, let me know and I'll convert them if I can. But again, keep in mind, all my recipes have to be vegan and gluten-free, and then I can add on those other adjustments as needed and if possible. So anyway, see you in the next video, and check out these next videos.